Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Frances Fox Piven is a professor of political science and sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's also an instigator and a very important leader of movements for social justice and reform. And she's always been someone that I've admired very much.
Thank you, Ronnie. And it's nice to talk to you today.
And I admire you because of what you do, and also because, who you are. But you're a scholar, but you're also a great politician, not in the terms of supporting electoral candidates particularly, but in mapping strategy. You're really a strategist. And
well, I try to be.
Yeah.
That's what I think about a lot.
Did you start as a sociologist and political scientist with that in mind? Were you always an activist?
I don't know if I was always an activist, but I got my PhD and sort of came out of school in the 1960s. And all this stuff was happening, and it was awesome. I thought it was so interesting and so exciting. What I had wanted to do when I was in school, I wanted to understand social change, how it occurred. I was going to figure it all out.
Yeah, right. Well, that's good.
But then everybody was in the streets, everybody was moving. And you turned on the evening news and you would see film footage of civil rights marches, these incredibly heroic people coming out of centuries of bondage and confronting police dogs. It just swept me away.
It was so exciting. It really, yeah. Why is it that some people are so taken with it and other people are repelled by it? What?
Well, I think...
You're not a scientist, so I don't know if we can go into the whole thing, but it's very interesting that some people just respond so.
Well, I think a lot of people are repelled by it because they live lives so committed to order, to routine, to niceness, to being correct. And I think, well, those people just have a bad bringing up.
And to accept what's given to them.
Well, accept what's given to them and really be so timid about challenging any prescription. And as a consequence, of course, they miss a lot about what's so great about life, which is to push, to join with others, to try to affect your world. That's a good life.
In your first book, the big book that you did was Regulating the Poor?
That's right, yeah.
And that was when, in 1971, 72?
That's right.
So that was at the time of the the welfare rights group.
Yeah, Richard Cloward, who co-authored that book with me, he and I we got this idea in about 1965. And the idea arose out of work we were doing on the Lower East Side, where we were supposed to be doing research, and we were supposed to be doing research on a poverty program, Mobilization for Youth. And one of the activities of that program consisted of a set of storefront offices. Social workers sat behind desks in the storefronts. We were supposed to evaluate that. And we didn't know exactly what they were doing. So we asked them to keep records of what they did, who came in, what their problem was, and what did you do about the problem. Very simple records. And we looked at those records and we saw that the overwhelming majority of people who came into the storefronts for help, didn't have trouble with their family relations or things like that they needed counseling about. But their problem was that they were going to be evicted because they didn't have money for rent. Or their problem was that school was going to begin in September and they didn't have any money for shoes for the kids. So the social workers would either call the welfare department or go to the welfare department with them. So and then they got some money. So that was very interesting to us. We said to ourselves, well, if they're eligible for welfare, how come they're not on welfare? How come they have to get the social workers' help to get on welfare? So we started scanning survey data on income, family composition, surveys that were done for other purposes. First in New York, then we did this for other cities. And we estimated very roughly that for every person that was on welfare, there were 2 people who were eligible, who should have been getting these payments. So that was interesting. So then we got an idea. And the idea was, well, what if instead of one by one these people going in and talking to a social worker, what if there were efforts by activists to mobilize people to get their welfare benefits? And we tried to spell out what we thought would happen given the kind of democratic administration that was in Washington and its need for support from the minority poor and what the kind of strains it would cause in the city and in the state, and how we might be able to make governors and mayors lobbyists for a bigger federal role in welfare. That was a paper, and we called the paper, it was published as a strategy to end poverty, but I think we originally called the mimeograph. Remember mimeographs?
Yeah, of course I do.
The mimeograph version was something like what is to be done or how to mobilize the poor, and we peddled it to all the organizers we knew.
Oh, great.
And we searched for organizers who would take it up. And in that process, a lot of organizers didn't like it because it was welfare.
Yeah.
A lot of people didn't like it because it was welfare. Bayard Rustin said to us, I'd rather get one black woman a job as an airline stewardess than get 10 women onto welfare. You know, welfare was it was a
very
bad
negative.
thing.
Yeah.
But George Wiley, who was in the contest for succeeding James Farmer at CORE, didn't get the job, and he took it up.
That was
he
lucky.
took it up.
And he was great.
And he was great, and we worked with him for years, raising money, going to all the demonstrations, going
So
to
were
all the
you
meetings.
part of, when McGovern was running, didn't he have a program for a guaranteed minimum income? Mm-hmm. Was that developed partly with some of your work, or was that all part of the same movement?
I think, I think at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, everybody was talking about a guaranteed income. Yeah. Johnson was talking about a guaranteed income before he stepped down. And part of the reason was that there was a much different sense of what it meant to be poor in the United States than there is today. I mean, today we regard the poor as if there's something wrong with them. At that time, poverty was a problem that we all shared and we all should do something about. So that was one.
Is that because you think it was closer to the Depression?
No, I don't think so. I think it was because two reasons. One, there was the old Democratic Party was in power, and it had links to labor, organized labor. It also had a great need for minority electoral support in the cities. That was part of the reason. And then the other part of the reason was that there was something like a movement of poor people. It was inspired by the civil rights movement, inspired by the poverty program. After all, JFK initiated the idea of a poverty program way back in 1963, and Lyndon Baines Johnson took it up.
Right, and that's when we had the OEO,
OEO,
and all those things. Office of Economic Opportunity.
The Office of Economic, and all of the community action agencies.
And all those programs that funded the community action groups and everything. It was an exciting time.
It was.
So
was
now
an
what's
important
happened?
time.
In this last election, all you heard about was the middle class. Has the middle class, but I've never understood really what they call the middle class, because it seems to me the middle class is very close to the working poor, and the working poor are then separated from other poor people who aren't working. Is that it?
Well, I mean, the
You're so right that we think
the term working class has never been very fashionable in the United States. There's a sense in which we are, as a culture, I think, infected with a sort of Protestant commitment to upward mobility and propriety, and middle class goes down easier. But you know, whenever somebody says the middle class, they mean working people.
But I always thought we were all in the middle class, and then there was the upper class. Or what I mean, the upper class. That's what, but the rich people. But most people are middle class, and then you've got poor people, and then you had middle income and low income, and those distinctions, and they all seem to be. But we're trying to forget poor people, it seems.
Yeah. Well, for example, there's the press seems to take it for granted that. Now that hardly anybody's on welfare, the poverty problem is solved. And now that hardly anybody's on welfare, the poverty problem is worse, and it's getting worse each year in the last couple of years, since unemployment it's sort of gone up, and we've never really reduced it since the early 2001, 2002 recession. So there's unemployment, hardly any welfare.
Housing.
All the other programs have been cut back. Housing, health care. They want to cut food stamps. It's very, very important, the minimum wage. A lot of people are working close to the minimum wage. Minimum wage is probably at its lowest level in its history.
What is it now?
It's $5.15 an hour.
There's always been all these studies about the cost of living in New York, and it's a wonderful organization, and I can't think of the name of it, that estimates the cost of living in New York for
the Fiscal Policy Institute.
Yes, and what does that come to? $45,000 or $50,000 it takes to live here, and not extravagantly by any means, just barely to manage to go to do it.
Well, in Manhattan, that's the rent.
Right, that's right. So now there's so much I want to talk to you about, but we're already halfway through. You've written a book. You wrote it before the election, The War at Home, but you talk about, what do you call it? Bush's. It's a new definition of imperialism, or it's a complicated. What do you call it?
Well, I argued in the book that we usually think of imperialism as war with foreign nations, and the imperial power goes to war in order to plunder those foreign nations. But this war, we're not succeeding in plundering anybody, although we're we're killing a lot of people. But the plunder seems to be of Americans. Americans are paying for the, $500 billion in military costs. And it's mostly now the middle class or the working class that is paying it, because the tax code has been changed, so the taxes on capital have really been slashed. So we're paying for the military, we're paying for the occupation, we're paying for those contractors that go over there and make tens of billions of dollars, and at the same time, not only are we paying all of this tax revenue for very dubious purposes, but the programs on which Americans depend are being slashed. And that includes not only programs for the poor, but it also includes health care programs. Look at the plans for Social Security. It includes spending for infrastructure. I was struck by how in Bush's new budget proposals, he eliminated the Amtrak, federal subsidy for Amtrak. We don't need a railroad,
apparently. What could be more important to us than that transportation ability? And at the same time, the American automobile industry is in trouble. So it's do you think this is the most dangerous time you've lived in?
Yes, I do. It's by no means clear to me that we will, survive and turn it around, although I think we desperately have to try to. And in many ways. One is the oligarchy that's developing in the United States. It's an economic oligarchy. We have extreme riches, more poor, and ordinary working people are finding it very hard to keep up with healthcare costs, with housing costs, but also I think our democratic arrangements are being tampered with in ways that are very, very upsetting, very alarming. I don't take it for granted that Bush won even the election in 2004. We don't really know, but he clearly didn't win the election in 2000. And then there are the environmental consequences of the rollback of environmental regulation and the unwillingness of the administration to support international efforts to control pollution. A lot is going on that could lead to disaster,
Well,
even planetary disaster.
You wrote a book about why people don't vote, and then there was another one, why people still don't vote.
Right.
So what happened, and what can we do about it? I mean, what is the next way? How do we end this? This book was written before the election, and although you weren't a great fan of John Kerry's, you said that you felt it would be a better world for us if John Kerry was elected.
We'd have a chance to fight another day.
Yeah, right. It's a whole interesting concept about the use of power to change public policy. But where are we now? You also say that when people who are diametrically opposed to what you believe in are in power, it's harder to mobilize people. So we've got these people who are obviously taking us in a direction that many of us have grown up with since Franklin Roosevelt, that's just totally different. What are we going to do? Well, how did we lose the election?
There are two ways that people think about this usually. One way is, well, we've got to mobilize and win the next election. This gets harder to do, partly because of the extraordinary propaganda capacity they've developed, and they have a lot of money, a lot of fat cat contributions to develop that capacity, and they're willing to freely use government funds for their own program funds. For their own propaganda.
Seen that in all those films and the things that were supposedly news clips and things that came out of government agencies. Yeah.
So, and then also, the supposedly independent media are big media now. They're major corporate interests in their own right, and they're allies of the Bush administration. The election process itself is very distorted. And people say, well, we've got to fix that. We've got to have a national voter registration system. We've got to have a national right to vote. We don't have a national right to vote in this country. And then also we've got to watchdog every local election board, every county election board, and every voting place to make sure that they don't fool around with the process, as they have been doing, as the Republicans have been doing.
The prime example was Ms. Harris in Florida.
The felon disenfranchisement, particularly by Catherine Harris.
She did that, yes. But also that she was the co-chair of the Bush campaign.
Right.
When she was in charge of the elections.
Kenneth Blackwell also was a Bush campaign official. He was the Secretary of State chief election official in Ohio, which was a battleground.
This past year.
Yeah. So another reform is nonpartisan election officials. Well, those are, and election day should be a holiday. We're the only major democracy in the world where working people don't get time off
to vote.
Well, those are all good ideas. I'm for them all. The trouble is that until you win an election,
and you have a majority of the votes, you're not going to be able to change anything. You're not going to be able
to change anything. So there is an electoral path that people are invested in, and there's no point in being cynical about that, although I am a little cynical about it, because people are going to work on that. However, I think that the major moments of reform in American history have never occurred just through electoral politics. They've occurred through the rise of defiant, unruly protest movements. That was how we got the American Revolution. And it was how we got the emancipation of black slaves, the abolitionist movement. It was how we got labor rights.
And the suffragettes.
Suffragettes. It's how we finally got civil rights.
But why are we all so quiet?
Why are we all so quiet? Well, it's very hard to predict the moments of
Right.
unquiet. It's hard to predict
What's going to happen and
there,
how it happens.
There are, many, many social movement analysts in academia. I don't think any of them would hazard to predict the point at which a movement emerges. I did think that if the Democrats had won the White House, that the environment would be more hospitable to protest movements, progressive protest movements, because people are afraid that they'll get locked up, for one thing. They're afraid of repression. And also, and there's a lot to be afraid of with the Bush administration. But the other reason is the protest movements win what they win because they're able to break through the wall of propaganda. They have a kind of dramatic presence. They are communicators. And they polarize the society. Some people respond to the grievances that they raise, and some people get very angry and annoyed. But that polarization is something that politicians have to deal with. Just, in LBJ, a Southerner who wore magnolia in his buttonhole for most of his career in the Congress, became a champion of civil rights because the civil rights movement so polarized American society.
That he had no choice.
He had no choice.
Right. So it's very good. I'm thinking now of where we see any of it, the bicyclists in New York City. That's how, there was a march yesterday. But I don't know. It's very discouraging in a way. Do you think the internet helps or hinders this kind of thing?
Helps.
It does.
I think it does help.
By communicating? By
communicating very quickly and over great distances.
But it doesn't eliminate the own personal actions that have to be taken. I mean, you can't do it all on the internet.
Oh, you can't do it on the internet.
No.
The internet is a way to reach people and tell them what's happening
right.
and where to come.
Right.
No, the internet is not the movement. The internet is a tool of the movement. But, when it looked as though Bush was going to invade Iraq on that February 15th, the 2003, wasn't it? The 10 million people demonstrated around the globe.
The world was most incredible.
That could not have happened without the internet. Now, it's true that it didn't stop the war in Iraq, but it prevented Bush from organizing a coalition of allies to mount that war. And that's just as well that he didn't, because in the aftermath of the invasion, it's easier to see what was wrong.
Right, and what we really were up to. Right. Do you think that the press, so we talked about the media, do you think that they were stung by the misleading statements and actions of the Bush administration so that they're now a little bit more questioning of what's happening and what's told to them?
Yeah, a little.
I think so, a little bit.
Little.
Yeah.
If you mean like the New York Times and the Washington Post, I think a little bit. But the problem is that nobody reads the Washington Post and the New York Times. They all watch Fox News. It's a big problem.
Now we have this other question about public broadcasting, which is interesting to see.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
They infiltrate everywhere. It's amazing.
They're so bold and brazen about it. And that's the part that, they're everything. They're both out front and they're both hidden, aren't they?
They're conspiratorial.
Is that the word?
I think that's the word.
They're making us conspiratorial.
Well, we see conspiracies, and what is a conspiracy? A conspiracy is a plan between people, has to be more than one to be a conspiracy, where people plan ahead and don't tell you about it. Now, I ask you, is that going on?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you think any of this is the fault of the Democratic Party?
Certainly. Certainly. I think that we can blame Karl Rove for 2004, but we should also blame Kerry and the Democrats. I don't think Kerry was clear about anything. I don't think he had the right persona to be the Democratic champion.
Do you think there's the role of parties the way they were with Roosevelt, Johnson, Kennedy, that time? It has changed. Do you think it's ever going to change again? The party is so weak. Is that because of television? Is it because
It won't be the same kind of
candidates
party.
can go directly and they don't need the party because of the cost of campaigning and the whole thing that goes into it?
Well, the way in which political scientists talk about this, they say that we used to have campaigns that were based on foot soldiers that went door to door, and now we have campaigns that are based on television advertising. But it's notable that quite a few people turned out as foot soldiers.
They did.
In this last election. So maybe it isn't one direction, unidirectional trend.
The problem was, though, the places that they turned out didn't make a difference, did it? Did it?
Probably in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, but not in Ohio. So part of that depends.
Well, we don't know because we still don't know what
the results in Ohio.
We don't know about we don't know what computers did to the vote count. Now
you were a very active supporter. We have less than a minute, but you were very active when you analyzed why people don't vote and everything into this whole voter registration law. It's called what? It's the
National Voter Registration Act, Motor Voter. What happened with that? Well, it was never implemented in many of the agencies. It was implemented in a lot of driver's license bureaus, but it was never implemented in welfare, food stamp, or Medicaid agencies, which the law requires. Indeed, the New York State enabling legislation requires CUNY and SUNY to do voter registration at course registration of their students, and they will not do it.
Why? Well, we can't do it. We're out of time, but that's a good thing to bring up on our next time, and I hope you'll come back because we need to talk about more of the politics.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Frances Fox Piven.